Our electricity bill suddenly shot up. Panicked, I called the power company. A worker arrived and, looking puzzled, asked, "Did you see this wire before?" Bob and I hurried over as the worker moved a potted plant aside for a better view. There, from our outdoor outlet, stretched a strange wire leading to my in-laws' house. "Do you recognize this wire?" The worker's question made Bob and me exchange knowing glances. "Hey Bob, could this be?" "Yeah, no doubt. This explains our crazy electric bill." Bob unplugs the wire quickly. Suddenly, a loud scream comes from my in-laws' place. "What?" "It's probably my mother-in-law." Then there's frantic muttering. The voice grows louder, and suddenly, my mother-in-law jumps out from the bushes. "I'm Mary Johnson, a 32-year-old stay-at-home mom. I love trying out limited-time desserts as a hobby. I enjoy gathering dessert info from friends or doing research. My husband Bob, who's the same age as me, has always supported my hobbies. We've known each other since college, and I've always admired his kindness. I also have a deep fondness for my in-laws who raised such a wonderful man." Many of my Mary friends complained about their mothers-in-law, but thankfully, that's not the case for us. My mother-in-law and I share a love for desserts, and she's always happy when I bring her treats. My father-in-law, though quiet, always has a reassuring smile. They've always been kind to me, and I feel the same about them. They live about a 30-minute drive away. Not too close, not too far away, just the perfect distance. But sometimes I wonder if maybe we could live together, the four of us. It's not that I'm eager for it, but I think we might get along better than expected. I admire them enough to entertain such thoughts. However, life doesn't always go as smoothly as we hope. One day, I was shocked by the news from Bob. "Your parents?" It turns out my in-laws were moving into the empty house next door. I always assumed they owned their place, but it seems they were renting. Their house had aged, prompting them to consider moving. When they discovered the vacant house next to ours, they seized the opportunity. It's a sudden, close move. Anxiety immediately washed over me. So far, I've had a good relationship with my in-laws, but I worry about how this will change things. Living next door means we could see each other every day if we wanted to. I do like my in-laws, but truthfully, seeing them daily feels overwhelming. However, I can't just say that now. It's too late to back out. In fact, when we learned about the move, Bob gently suggested to his parents, "Maybe you shouldn't." But they brushed it off, insisting, "We get along so well now. It'll be fine. I once thought we could even live together." I regret ever entertaining such optimistic thoughts. As my anxiety heightened, my in-laws moved in next door. We greeted them cautiously, and initially things seemed fine. We kept a respectful distance and set boundaries. But as they settled in, my mother-in-law began to overstep boundaries like never before. She started exhibiting all the "don't do this" behaviors you hear about. Dropping by unannounced became routine, and once inside, she acted like it was her own home. Not only that, it felt like they were monitoring our every move. Then, on the day my mother-in-law showed up uninvited and commented on our dinner, she said something unbelievable. "Hey Mary, I've been thinking maybe you could stop locking the door." I was speechless. Can you imagine, in this day and age, my mother-in-law suggesting we leave our door unlocked? Not locking it means anyone could walk in at any time, which is not only unsettling but clearly unsafe. Since my mother-in-law moved nearby, even the sound of the doorbell makes my heart race. Now there's a chance she could just stroll into our house without us even noticing. That's definitely not something I'm comfortable with. Given the current circumstances, I have to admit, the thought of leaving the door unlocked is unsettling. Trying to keep the mood light, I politely declined with a smile. However, she frowned and responded, "Oh Mary, you're such a warrior. But don't worry, I'll ask our neighbors to keep an eye out for you. And remember, your father-in-law and I are nearby. We'll be dropping in often." I know her intentions are good, and I appreciate that. That's why I couldn't bring myself to tell her how overwhelming her frequent visits had become, but everyone has their limits. Last week, it felt like she was always at our doorstep. Having tea with my mother-in-law every day at our house naturally leads to some tensions. I've come to realize that maintaining a healthy relationship between a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law is all about finding the right balance. She'd leave random potted plants in our yard or plant flowers without asking, as if she had free rein. If it happened once in a while, I could overlook it, but it became a daily occurrence. Since the door incident, she's brought it up multiple times. I managed to deflect her by citing my strong security concerns as a wife. However, once that was settled, my mother-in-law started asking for a spare key. I knew I had to get Bob to reject her request. Giving her such a powerful item now was simply not an option. Despite my disagreements with her behavior, I didn't exactly dislike her. She could be intrusive, but I understood it came from good intentions. Instead, I felt more guilty about turning her down than anything else. But over time, those feelings began to shift. Whether it was me, her, or both of us changing, I couldn't say. However, I started to feel uneasy and annoyed by her remarks. It was a few months after she moved in. By then, it had become routine for her to visit after lunch. I once inquired about my father-in-law, and it seems he typically goes for walks or shopping alone. I suggested she join him, but she declined, saying, "Walking tires me out." Lately, she's become a typical mother-in-law. Before, when I made her tea, she'd just say thank you. But now there's always a comment like, "It's lukewarm," or "It's weak." Every time she speaks, it's either gossip or speaking ill of someone. Being around her brings me down. But I can't exactly push her away, so I just nod and force a smile. It's not a great situation, right? The grass keeps growing, and they never cut it. I've even thought about mowing it myself. Today, my mother-in-law was passionately discussing a neighbor's consistently neglected yard, so I was like, oh, when she suddenly stopped talking, I instinctively followed her gaze to the bookshelf. Did she find a book she liked? It'd be peaceful if we can just read together. Did you find a book you're interested in? As I was about to approach the bookshelf, she reached past it, grabbing something from the rack next to it. Susan, you shouldn't touch that. Upon seeing what she took, I quickly reached out, but she innocently opened it, then exclaimed with delight, "Oh my Mary dear, oh dear, didn't you overspend last month? Goodness, your electricity bill is twice as much as ours." What? My mother-in-law was looking at, as if she were reading a weekly magazine, was our household account book. Stop, give it back. When I quickly took it away, my mother-in-law chuckled softly. You really don't have to be so flustered. But Mary, it seems like you're not so good at saving money. Bob must feel bad having a wife who struggles with budgeting. You should try a bit harder, okay? My face burned with embarrassment as my mother-in-law boldly opened the household account book, clearly labeled on both the front and back covers. I was incredulous. Regarding the desserts, I have a soft spot for limited edition treats too, so I understand the temptation. But if you can't save a dime, do you truly deserve to indulge in sweets? Adding to the frustration, my mother-in-law kept on nagging, criticizing our spending on food and a skyrocketing electricity bill. She even boasted about her own frugality. After her tirade, she seemed content and left. Once she was gone, I was overwhelmed with emotion and couldn't stop crying. The built-up stress likely played a role as well. I had reached my breaking point. I cried uncontrollably until Bob returned home. You don't have to take Mom's criticisms to heart, he reassured me, though I found it easier said than done. I'm really sorry. I'll talk to Mom and ask her not to visit as often, he added, comforting me. After I had calmed down a bit, I decided to address another concern that had been weighing on me, the soaring electricity bill, as pointed out by my mother-in-law. It had inexplicably spiked over the past few months. I was worried about it, but dealing with my mother-in-law had consumed all my attention. Bob examined the details of the electricity bill, puzzled. This is definitely unusual. I know, right? The next bill is due soon, isn't it? If it seems off again, we should contact the electric company, I suggested. A few days later, a bill arrived, shocking us with a whopping $1,300 increase, more than double our usual amount. Sensing something was wrong, we quickly arranged for a technician from the electric company to visit. The technician conducted a thorough inspection and then directed our attention to something peculiar. Were you aware of this wire? As Bob and I approached, the technician gently moved a potted plant, revealing an external outlet hidden beneath its long leaves. We had forgotten about it since we never used it after building the house. From that outlet, the technician pointed out, a wire extends, leading towards my in-laws' house. Do you know anything about this wire? At the technician's question, Bob and I exchanged knowing glances. We both had a suspicion. Hey Bob, could this be? Yeah, without a doubt. This explains our sky-high electric bill. To confirm, we followed the wire with the technician, navigating through bushes and tall weeds. True enough, The wire led to my in-laws' storage shed. We couldn't see where it connected from our vantage point, but it was evident that it had something to do with their house. The technician, with a serious expression, asked, "Should I call the police?" "No, we might have to, but let's talk to them first. This house belongs to our parents after all," I explained. The worker initially seemed tense, perhaps suspecting theft of electricity, but upon realizing it was a family home, his expression softened with relief. "Oh, I see. I'll be on my way then." "Yes, thank you for taking the time to come out here. We really appreciate it," I replied gratefully. We escorted him to his vehicle and watched him drive off. After he left, Bob and I turned to each other, lost in thought. Bob let out a heavy sigh, resting his head in his hands. "I'm sorry for having a mother like that," he said with a hint of frustration. "It's hard to say. Don't worry about it. What should we do next?" If it's like any other day, Bob's parents are probably home right now. Should we confront them directly, or should we come up with a plan first? Bob, his hand covering his mouth, began to walk towards the external outlet. Thanks to the employee who had moved the potted plant earlier, the outlet was now clearly visible. Come to think of it, maybe his mother intentionally placed the potted plant here to conceal this outlet. Though I hate to suspect, I can't think of any other reason. I wonder what this is connected to, I mused. Suddenly, Bob reached out and swiftly unplugged the wire. "Wait, is it okay to unplug that?" I asked, a bit concerned. "I just did. The thought of them calmly stealing our electricity all this time makes me furious," Bob replied indignantly. "Anyway, we have the employee as a witness. I won't let them make any excuses. If necessary, we have that as well," he added firmly. "That's true." I nodded in agreement, feeling determined. Suddenly, a piercing scream echoed from Bob's parents' house, likely my mother-in-law's. Moments later, we heard frantic muttering and the voices started approaching us. Then, with great force, my mother-in-law burst out from behind the hedge, clearly not expecting to find us there. Upon seeing us, she let out a surprised gasp. "What are you two doing here?" she snapped. I stood tall and replied, "Susan, do you have business in our yard? You seem quite flustered." She looked away, visibly uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Bob held onto the removed wire firmly. When my mother-in-law exclaimed, "Oh," and tried to snatch it from Bob, he deftly hid it behind his back. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "No, that's what I should be asking you," Bob retorted, thrusting a wire in front of her face. "This was plugged into our outlet." He emphasized the word "our." My mother-in-law's eyes darted around, and then she defensively looked upwards. "So what? Do you know where this wire goes?" "I have no idea," she admitted. "Just plug it back in now. Things are a mess here since you pulled it out." I couldn't believe her audacity. She was essentially admitting to causing the issue without any remorse. But my mother-in-law seemed more panicked than guilty. I understood why she was so flustered. Smiling reassuringly, I spoke up. "Susan, please calm down. Let's discuss this calmly. How can we plug in a wire when we don't know where it leads? This is our outlet, right? It's not so simple to just plug it in, especially when we don't understand its purpose," I insisted. My mother-in-law squirmed uncomfortably. "Oh, Susan, remember what you said to me? You lectured me about not wasting electricity and criticized Bob for having a wife who couldn't save on energy." "Well now," she trailed off, clearly flustered. "I won't make it in time," I heard her mutter under her breath. "What time is it now?" "It's 9:57. "Oh no, I'm going to be late." With that, my mother-in-law hastily left, stumbling as she went. Bob looked perplexed by his mother's odd behavior, and I quietly explained the reason to him. "Huh? Is that what you meant?" he mused. "So if we stick around, she'll show up again." "Exactly," I confirmed. Bob tossed the wire aside, and we returned inside the house. Shortly after, I heard a rattling sound at the front door, followed by the doorbell ringing. "It's my mother-in-law," I announced as I unlocked the door and opened it. "Hello, Susan," she greeted, pushing past me and entering the house. She seemed visibly upset, her footsteps echoing heavily as she made her way to the living room and plopped down onto the sofa. Bob, who was already there, looked puzzled, but before he could speak, my mother-in-law interjected. "Oh, I'm thirsty. Is the tea not ready yet?" "You're so slow. It's common courtesy to act before being told, you know," she complained. "And another thing, why do you always lock the door?" Everyone in the neighborhood thinks I have a standoffish daughter-in-law. There's nothing valuable in this house anyway. It's just pretentious and annoying, she continued to grumble. Oh, it's hopeless. I've had enough, I declared, grabbing the half-empty plastic bottle nearby and slamming it down on the table in front of my stunned mother-in-law. She sat there, eyes wide with shock. Here you go, Mary, your water. You said there's nothing worth stealing in this house. But unfortunately, there were deceitful and sneaky people out there, like those who steal electricity. I could see the panic in her eyes as I sat beside her. Despite being so close, she couldn't bring herself to meet my gaze, her face drained of color. Mary, what's wrong? You seem different, I remarked. Really, Susan? Even I have my limits. Did you think I was some sort of deity? I tried to lighten the mood with humor, but she seemed as terrified as if she'd encountered a demon. Turning to Bob for help, she found him shaking his head, with her daughter-in-law transformed into something akin to a demon beside her, and Bob unwilling to aid her. My mother-in-law's next move was unsurprising. I apologize. I just remembered an errand I need to attend to, she stammered, attempting to leave. You're not going anywhere, I asserted, pushing her shoulder as she rose from the couch, causing her to sink back into the cushions. Mary, I really must. She began, but I interrupted. You were the one who claimed to be thirsty, weren't you? You made a fuss, and now you're saying you can't drink water. Quite hypocritical, don't you think? Tears welled in her eyes as she reached for her bottle. But this time, Bob intervened. My mother-in-law seemed momentarily relieved, but she was still adamant about not letting me drink the remaining water. Now the real problem begins, I continued sternly. When did you start stealing our electricity? You often accuse me of theft, which is a terrible accusation. But the wire plugged into my outlet actually originates from your house, doesn't it? My mother-in-law struggled to come up with a plausible excuse, opening and closing her mouth several times as she pondered how to extricate herself from the situation. To be honest, she's backed into a corner. Is she clueless? All she has to do now is up to it and say sorry. I mused, but it seemed fate had thrown my mother-in-law a lifeline. The doorbell rang, and upon answering, I found my father-in-law standing there. Is Susan around? Apparently, he had stepped out for a quick shopping trip. Returning home, he found the front door unlocked and the TV still on, but his wife was nowhere to be found. Understandably, he was concerned. Spotting her chance, my mother-in-law rushed to him, tears streaming down her face. My father-in-law looked rather embarrassed by his wife's distressed state. Sensing the need to clarify everything, Bob stepped in and recounted the situation from the beginning. After pondering for a moment, my father-in-law began to speak slowly. Isn't there some misunderstanding? Naturally, he found it hard to believe that his own wife had been secretly tapping into their son's electricity supply. Then who did the wiring? Do you think a stranger would go through the trouble of connecting someone else's wiring to another house? My father-in-law pondered, crossing his arms in thought. Eventually, he nodded and suggested, let's go take a look first, rising from his seat. However, my mother-in-law, clearly flustered, attempted to intervene. Ignoring her protests, my father-in-law asked Bob to guide him and headed towards the power outlet. The wiring disappeared into a storage shed, out of sight from where they stood. After my father-in-law investigated and returned, his face drained of color. I'm deeply sorry. Please apologize to them, he urged, while my mother-in-law muttered her apology like a child. He explained that the wires led to a battery connected to my mother-in-law's computer via an extension cord. She had purchased the battery when she moved to a new house, intending to use it for emergencies. However, a salesman had advised her that storing electricity during cheaper nighttime hours and using it during the day was cost-effective. So she began using our house's electrical outlet to store electricity at night and power her home during the day. Initially, she only used it for that purpose, but as her extension cord had an extra socket, she started plugging in her computer and other appliances. Eventually, she was drawing electricity from our house all day long. When confronted, she defended herself, claiming she thought it was more economical. I was not only upset about her unauthorized use of our electricity, but also enraged by her hypocrisy. You often criticized Bob for having a wife who can't save money and mocked my spending habits on sweets, didn't you? I reminded her. Her lack of remorse was glaring. Saving money on your electricity bill by using someone else's electricity isn't saving money. It's theft, I admonished. And I won't overlook this just because we're family. If you don't sincerely apologize, we'll have no choice but to involve the police. My mother-in-law looked taken aback. Did she honestly believe she could get away with it? What kind of wife are you? Are you willing to betray your own family? I retorted sharply. Let's not distort things. We're a family, and we just want to ensure everything is fair, I countered. As I reached for my phone, she panicked and lunged towards me, but Bob intercepted her. You have no evidence, she protested desperately. With all this evidence, do we need more? If so, we can provide something even more conclusive, I declared, gesturing towards the roof. My mother-in-law strained to see, and her face drained of color. Yes, our house had security cameras installed, and by chance, the area around the outlet fell within their range. My mother-in-law let out a soft gasp of distress. Is this proof enough? I questioned. Oh, and one more thing. Is there something else? I added. You were in a hurry today because of the limited edition dessert release, weren't you? I teased, flashing a sly smile. Indeed. I had a friend purchase it for me, so I managed to secure it safely. If you hadn't been so fixated on siphoning electricity, you might have been able to order it online. What a pity, I remarked. My mother-in-law collapsed to the ground, trembling and defeated. After discussing it with Bob, we decided against involving the police. While she had confessed and we had evidence, it seemed more trouble than it was worth. Plus, considering she was family, there was a chance it would be overlooked anyway. Instead, we agreed that my in-laws would cover the electricity they used and provide additional compensation for the inconvenience caused. Despite the inevitable awkwardness of living in close proximity, it was a necessary step for my peace of mind. As tensions rose, our interactions with my in-laws dwindled. Then we received unexpected news. They decided to move back to their previous house. Rumors about electricity theft, particularly involving my mother-in-law, had spread, deeply upsetting her. She tearfully expressed her desire to return to their old home. Surprisingly, I discovered that my mother-in-law didn't have the strong relationships with her neighbors that I had assumed. Instead, she was treated delicately, like a fragile object. After covering the compensation and moving costs, my in-laws found themselves financially strained. However, we made it clear that we wouldn't be offering any financial assistance. It's up to them to adjust their spending habits and manage on their own. With my mother-in-law gone, I've been enjoying life to the fullest each day. Our electric bill has significantly decreased, and now I'm contemplating which dessert to indulge in next.